Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am going to discuss the very contentious meeting, rather unprofessional and undiplomatic at that, on 28th of October 2025 between President Trump, Vice President JD Vance, and the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. There has been a lot written about this since it happened. It was indeed very uncharacteristic for a high-level meeting, while televised, to have a spectacle of this sort, regardless of what one thinks about one side or the other. Just the protocol, just the setting itself was rather undiplomatic, to put it very kindly, and counterproductive in terms of advancing either the interests of the United States in the global stage or those of Ukraine, a country that has been at war with Russia, backed by NATO, especially during the Biden period, strongly by the United States, not anymore by the United States, and a country that has suffered enormously, with more than 1/3 of its population dislocated, displaced, either internally or externally. Poland, Romania, all the surrounding countries in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, they have fled. A country whose infrastructure has been damaged, a country that has a reconstruction program that will cost more than $500 billion. This is a devastating loss to property as well as to lives, continuing, of course, since this war is not over. Now, with regard to what happened, with regard to the theatrics, I would say, I would call this theatrics of what happened in that room. I did look at the videotape several times and try to see it from every possible perspective. There was the rather back and forth between the president, the vice president on one side, and on the other side, the president of Ukraine, which is understandable. The president of Ukraine, of course, feels very strongly. He has been at war. He feels very strongly against Vladimir Putin, that Vladimir Putin is the focus of all evil because he has visited such mass destruction on Ukraine. Understandable. That's fine. On the other side, of course, he was used to the United States handling him with kid gloves and with massive support during the Biden period. And when Donald Trump and JD Vance basically demonstrated that they were interested in cutting off this forever war doctrine, ending the forever war, cutting off the support for war and proceeding toward diplomacy, which, by the way, I fully support. I think the war should have ended long ago. The president of Ukraine reacted rather strongly basically showing that the record of the Kremlin going back to the annexation of the Crimea, which used to belong to Ukraine, in 2014, illustrates that there is no trust, that the issue is one of trust. Can you trust the Kremlin? And Zelensky's point was not. And then there was the insistence by the President of the United States, by the Vice President, then the President of the United States, that, of course, diplomacy is the only option and you can't go to war. You can't continue this war. And then, of course, it got out of hand and it turned into a street brawl, verbally, that is. The question, of course, is what does this all mean, the theatrics aside? Clearly, a very bad sign for Ukraine. Clearly, a very bad sign for U.S.-European relations. The fact is, the United States is not interested in supporting the continuation of this war. Not that I don't agree with that. However, there's a way to handle all of this, a professional way. This is not the way. The United States has also illustrated, and it showed all of its cards, unfortunately, in front of cameras, to China and to Russia, which it regards, well, the U.S., depending who is president, regards Russia as a rival. China, no matter who is president, is a rival. As far as either Democrat or Republican, it's a rival. And I'll talk about China, how China actually sees this from its perspective and what its role is as a result of this disastrous meeting between Zelenskyy, Trump, and JD Vance. I do want to point out that I want to give context to this because all of this is known. It's a matter of record. I want to point out that the Trump administration has a long-standing record because in its first term, it pursued a policy of neo-isolationism in sharp contrast with the Cold War liberals who pursued, Democrats and Republicans, who pursued the agenda of the neoconservatives, who are basically supporting a position of a forever war doctrine, military solutions to diplomatic conflicts no matter what. The isolationist policy, by the way, isolationism in the United States goes back to the 19th century, but really the era of isolationism in the United States is especially pronounced. It's out there and unfortunately very bad. During the three Republican administrations of the 1920s, from 1921 until 1933, when there were three Republican administrations, they were all isolationist, and unfortunately, that was a very bad thing because both in terms of managing the world economy, coordinating, I should say, managing perhaps sounds too heavy, too harsh, and also coordinating the Western democracies so as to support more democratic governments so that there would not be a rise of fascism in Europe and especially Nazi Germany, the Third Reich, with the election of Adolf Hitler in 1932, who took over 1933, January, the same year that FDR took over. So isolationism simply means that the U.S. retreated and it was not pursuing a multilateral policy. That is a policy of engaging in agreements with other nations, namely its European allies. Unfortunately, that turned out to be a disaster. It does not mean, isolationism, by the way, does not mean that the United States is not interested in bilateral relations. It is. It pursues bilateral. On the contrary, it does. That's exactly what it does. It pursues bilateral relations. And it doesn't mean that it's not interested in pursuing imperialist policies, because it did, actually, in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, during the interwar period, primarily as because of energy, because of oil, but also minerals in Latin America. So isolationism simply means that it will not go along in a multilateral setting with other nations and coordinate its foreign policy, because it sees that in that manner it compromises whatever it wants to accomplish in the global scene. Trump is an advocate of that. He is an advocate of bilateral relations. He's an advocate of neo-isolationism. And he came into the first administration with that mindset, did not believe that what the US did with involvements in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan paid dividends, that he believed they were very costly, which they were, by the way. The costs range from 5 to 7 trillion, if everything is added up. That the United States had nothing to gain. Ultimately, Afghanistan, of course, reverted back to the Taliban, so that there was no gain there. And certainly Iraq is a country where Iran has greater influence than it did before the US invaded. So Trump did not believe in that. He did not necessarily believe in regime change. In other words, what the US did under Democrats in Libya, overthrowing the Muammar Gaddafi government, in Syria, trying to overthrow Assad. Ultimately, of course, he was overthrown last year in December. And he did not believe in US military adventures, and he still doesn't. So he's not a Cold War militarist in the classical sense of the Cold War liberals, as well as some Rockefeller Republicans who follow that vein. Trump is an economic imperialist. He sees China as a rival. As he has put it, China is holding all the right cards, and he's right, it is holding all the right cards. In other words, it has the leverage globally because of the economic power that it has. So he's absolutely correct. China does hold all the right cards. So he is an economic imperialist, and he wants something tangible, an economic benefit out of foreign policy, for the corporate interests of the United States to gain something, for the United States private sector to gain something. And this is the approach to foreign policy. Get something tangible. Even with regard to Iraq, his comment was, at least we should have gotten the oil out of it. So he has a 19th century economic imperialism mentality. And going into this meeting with President Zelenskyy on the 28th, actually the meeting began with a dialogue about how Ukraine would yield to the United States approximately half of its mineral wealth, which is estimated, it's a rough estimate, but it's 15 trillion. And to yield that kind of assets back to the US, everything from gas to oil to rare earth minerals, which Ukraine has a lot. The problem, of course, with that issue is that much of that wealth in Ukraine is actually not in territory that Zelenskyy controls. It's in territory that Putin controls. It has been seized as a result of the war. Now, the fact is that the US did this war. It encouraged Ukraine. This is why to go to war against Putin. Although Putin invaded, by the way, Trump and the Republicans are absolutely wrong as far as facts are concerned, because even even the most partisan Russians would agree that they're the ones who invaded Ukraine. Ukraine did not invade Russia. That's just, at least let's agree about some basic facts. That's just a fact. In any event, the issue is that the U.S. pushed Ukraine into this, and even worse for all of Europe, actually, the U.S. Convinced NATO to go along with its strategy of NATO expansion and using Ukraine, a sovereign country, to do this by enticing Ukraine to go to war against Putin, getting Ukraine to become a NATO member, eventually an EU member, a European Union member, and using Ukraine as a stepping stone to the Black Sea, very important geopolitically and strategically, and then into the Transcaucasus region and into Central Asia as a counterweight. So NATO would keep going eastward. By the way, NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's not about Asia. Okay. Nevertheless, it would expand in Eurasia, and it would serve as a counterbalance against Russia, Iran, North Korea, China. So, and Ukraine was the gateway to all of this. So Ukraine was used in this proxy war without NATO, and especially the US behind NATO. None of this would have been possible. And one of the reasons the US wanted to do this was to cut off the overly dependent relationship between Western Europe, all of Europe actually, but especially Western Europe and specifically Germany with Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, the gas pipeline in the North Sea, coming from Russia to Germany directly and supplying gas to Europe. And it achieved that because the US wanted US companies to sell gas at much higher rates, by the way. So it wanted to break off energy dependence of Europe, okay? And it wanted less integration between Europe and Russia, considering that Russia is so closely integrated economically with China. Very important point here. So the US encouraged, in this sense, encouraged Ukraine to do this. And in this sense, I can understand the outrage of Zelensky coming here, because in the back of his head, and he couldn't say this, of course, in front of the cameras, I'm sure there was this idea, what are you talking about? You're the ones who asked us to go, who encouraged us, who pushed us into this war. If Biden, now it wasn't Trump, by the way, it wasn't Trump, it was Biden. It was the Cold War liberals who were behind them, were the neoconservatives, and behind them was the military-industrial complex and the Wall Street interests that profited from all this, by the way. They made money from all this. Fine. But from his point of view, from Zelensky's point of view, the United States did not have the position during the Biden administration that it does during the Trump administration. And here comes the president of Ukraine, all along being encouraged by the United States under a different president, and by the Europeans, solidly behind him, by the way, and by Japan and by Canada, by Australia, solidly behind him. And what does he find? He finds two people, Trump and JD Vance, saying, we're cutting you off. And by the way, there is this deal about the minerals, and I'll talk more about that in reconstruction programs and so forth. So there is this atmosphere from his point of view of, this war-torn country of Ukraine, which is immensely rich in agricultural products, by the way, in the primary sector of production. The primary sector of production is mining, forestry, agriculture, animal husbandry, all of that is primary sexual production. And Ukraine is such a country. It was during the Romanov period when the Tsars were ruling Russia. It was during the Soviet era, and it still is. And the West has been looking to integrate it and get the benefits that it can. And certainly the United States made no secret of it. However, the manner that this issue was approached by the United States, even Western mainstream media, television, newspapers, magazines, use the word American imperialism, Ukraine. Okay, so what we have here is a very direct approach to imperialism. Let me put it another way. This is the kind of thing, and it came up, unfortunately, during the meeting when JD Vance lectured Zelenskyy and said, you should be thanking the President of the United States. Of course, Zelenskyy had thanked the United States repeatedly and for all that it had done. I had read and seen it many times in videos. In any event, the issue was that the U.S. expected the kind of treatment from Zelenskyy that a 19th century colony would pay its respects, let's say India toward Great Britain, that was the master of India, the colonizer of India. Well, Zelenskyy did not exactly come from that with that kind of an attitude. He was willing to deal, but not at that level that the U.S. expected. It's no secret that the Trump administration, and I agree with them, has no love for neoconservatives because it does see them as warmongers, that they want military engagement, and that they want military engagement to the degree that it is a costly endeavor, and the Trump people don't see where the economic, especially the president himself, don't see where the economic benefit ultimately is for the United States. Okay, you dish out all this money, now what are our companies getting off for all this? Not necessarily the U.S. taxpayer that's paying for all this, but the companies, by the way. The other issue, I have to put this into context, is that Trump had a meeting exactly 10 days before he met with Zelenskyy. He met in Saudi Arabia, in Riyadh, with Lavrov, the U.S. administration, that is representative of the U.S., Marco Rubio, and representatives of the U.S. administration met with foreign ministry officials from Moscow, and this was also part of the tension in that meeting. Unfortunately, the U.S. did not invite Ukrainian representatives. No, neither did it invite Europeans. Left the Europeans out. I'll talk more about that. In 1919, during the Paris Peace Treaty, during the Versailles negotiations, the Versailles Treaty, the British and the French did not want the Germans present at the negotiations. They wanted to determine the peace terms and wanted to determine the makeup of the peace, the terms imposed on Germany, without Germany having a voice. You know what the result of that was? Adolf Hitler in 1933. In 1932, by the way, the German voters voted him in. He didn't stage a coup d'etat in 1932. He was voted in. and in January 33 he took over. So that was a disaster. You obviously engaging the party that is on the other side, the victim, especially if you have been carrying out a proxy war and you're behind that country, at the very least you invite representatives. It's just protocol. It's just protocol. And you allow them a voice at the table. The US did not do that. Never mind all the excuses, the pretext, the nonsense. It's just not done. The second thing is they didn't invite the Europeans. There is no doubt that there is and remains intense animosity toward the Europeans by this administration, which is neo-isolationist. The first thing it did is it pulled out of the Paris Peace Treaty. Very important to the Europeans, by the way. The Paris Climate Treaty, sorry, Peace Treaty. I meant to say the Climate Treaty. The Paris Climate Treaty is very important to the Europeans. Trump had done that before. This is unsettling, but not inviting at least Germany, France, and England. Let's say those three. And invite them all, just invite three of them, the largest three. Not inviting them, sidelining them, not inviting the other party in this war, namely Ukraine, and conducting bilateral relationship, bilateral diplomacy. It's clearly was to set the preconditions for what would take place for the terms that they would ultimately settle on, and this is ongoing, obviously. That was also a signal to the Europeans that the U.S. did not acknowledge the contributions of Europe to this proxy war, by the way, which in my view was a disaster. And in this fashion, the Trump administration is absolutely correct. It was going nowhere. It was a war of attrition, and it was a bloodbath, and it was just more destruction, more destruction. Besides, Russia, it's no secret, has the world's largest nuclear war arsenal, and that's just a fact. And behind it, all along was China, supporting it diplomatically and signing one trade agreement and one investment agreement after another. That's not a secret. And India taking advantage and making a lot of money in the process, smuggling a lot of the oil to the West, including to the Europeans and the United States. A lot of that oil wound up back in the US, by the way, never mind that there were sanctions and all of that. So all of this, obviously, rather odd, unconventional, if we follow diplomatic protocol. Historically, if we follow diplomatic protocol, this is not the way things are done. Now, one could argue that Trump had adopted the Kissinger approach to foreign policy, although I doubt. He has admitted, by the way, that he doesn't read much. I doubt that he has read Kissinger's book on Prince Clemens von Metternich. And this is Metternichian diplomacy, that when there is a regional conflict, the great powers resolve it amongst themselves. They don't go directly to the lesser powers. Whatever one wants to think, however even if you try to put the best face on it, there is a problem here, and the problem manifested itself in this emotional explosion, which, of course, revealed in itself before cameras in the White House, unfortunately for all parties concerned, in my view, by the way. There is another issue here that is simultaneously playing a role, and that is that against this background, all along, the US was holding the threat of tariffs over the head of Europeans. And that was one issue, the tariff threat. The second issue was that the Trump administration was holding over their heads the resentment that they have toward the way Europeans overregulate high-tech industries, especially Google, on the European continent. Okay, that's another issue. That they overtax, that they do not consume enough American products, especially American cars. So there were these side issues. Above all, there was, and this was revealed in a meeting between President Trump and President Macron in the White House, there was the issue of, we, the United States, contributed more to that war over there in Ukraine than you Europeans. And the Europeans resented that because the reality is that all statistics indicate, these are numbers, this is not to do politics, indicate that because the US encouraged that war in Ukraine, partly because it wanted NATO expansion, it wanted to capture market share, but also because it wanted to further manipulate Europe into a lesser role, the way they were during the early Cold War, as a satellite, and sell them more natural gas and oil, that is energy, sell them more of that and more American products, period. Everything from services, banking, and so forth, capture more of a market share in the European continent. The Europeans suffered as a result the inflationary pressures of the Ukrainian war. Now, no one forced them. They could have not, they didn't have to go along. They went along, by the way. Let me be very clear. These are not babies. These are adults. They knew what they were doing. The Russophobia was used for domestic purposes, very clearly. Okay. They went along because their corporate interests and the US corporate interests converged in this sense. And so they figured, we'll make money. And many European corporations did make money out of this war, as they did out of the one in Israel. Okay. So there's no doubt about that. So they have no one to blame here. You can't blame Trump. It was Biden, after all, who was in office when they made this decision. They also resented, however, with Trump specifically, the fact that he wanted them to spend more on of a share of GDP as a percentage, go from 3% to 5%, I believe. He wanted them to spend a lot more, not that they would come even close, by the way. In reality, they don't even spend 3% on average. I think only two countries in all of NATO spend about 3%. In any case, the Trump administration wanted them to spend more on defense, pay more for NATO, in other words, and presumably buy more weapons from American companies. And there was also the veiled threat. There were rumors that the US doesn't really need NATO, and it could really get out of NATO, and it doesn't have to go along with everything that NATO wants to do. In other words, that it would renege on its obligations as the leading NATO power. Just yesterday, today's March 3rd, yesterday was March 2nd, the Department of Defense, by the way, just to give you an idea that this is not just rhetoric, on the part of the United States. The Department of Defense, led by an individual who used to work as a news person on Fox News, and a second in command who was an investor, equity investor, investing in venture capitalist and so forth. I don't know what that has to do with defense. In any case, other than a procurement, I guess, buying, ordering tanks and submarines and airplanes. In any event, on March 2nd, 2025, the Department of Defense ordered the end of cyber warfare against Russia. It just so happens that the Department of Homeland Security in the United States has a large division which is carrying out such operations, cyber operations, on other countries, Russia included. The United States had accused Russia of cyber warfare. Microsoft, the Microsoft Corporation, had argued that, yes, it's true, Russia is targeting not just us, but a lot of the NATO countries, as well as Ukraine. So cyber attacks, countering their cyber attacks by our cyber attacks is important. That the order came in yesterday, March 2nd, to end those operations. So when we look at the cumulative effect of the overall policy of the Trump administration toward Europe plus Ukraine amid these threats of tariffs, the demands that the Europeans pay more, that they not regulate American companies as rigidly as they are regulating them, that they pay more for their own defense, that they spend more on NATO, that they haven't contributed enough to Ukraine, and that the US is the chief sponsor and aid donor for the war, has been, in other words, and demands reparations. Now, when I first read it, I think the story was broken by the British paper, The Telegraph. I think that was the first I saw it anyway. When I first read it, I just couldn't believe it. It looked like literally something out of the late 19th century that European colonial powers used to do with sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Or something, another example would be a good one, would be after the Boxers' rebellion in China was over. Started 1899, I think it was over a couple of years later, 1901 or so. The powers that went in to suppress the Boxers who were against foreign imperialists, from Japanese to Russians to Americans, and of course the Northwest Europeans, went in and they were exploiting the Chinese market, and of course were heavily in the business of selling opium to China. The Boxers were nationalist Chinese and they wanted foreigners out. The end of imperialism, Western as well as Japanese imperialism. What happens is that the Westerners suppressed the Boxers, these Chinese nationalists, and then they handed over the bill to the Chinese government and said, here, this is what you owe us for invading you and suppressing these people. Chinese government, we don't have this money. No problem. We'll loan it to you. We can't pay you back. Not a problem. We'll take over your custom houses and your ports. So financial control of China starts as a result of the Boxers' rebellion, because the imperialists from the West, Russia, Japan, went in and did what they did. Okay, military intervention. So they gave them the bill for military intervention. and imposed financial control. And that unleashed the era of the warlords in China, by the way. Chaos. Until Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai started the revolution in the 1940s. And of course, ultimately prevailed by 1949. This deal of give me half of the receipts of your mineral resources. Now, this deal was revised. It has undergone revisions. Let me be very clear, and that's true. But it just so happens that Ukraine is one of the countries that has rare earth minerals. Obviously, China has most of those in the world. It has a near monopoly, but there are some other countries from South Africa, some Latin American countries, by the way, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine. Russia has a lot of those, by the way. Ukraine has a small percentage of the world's rare earths. Those are used in high tech and defense. Very important to the US. The problem is much of that rare earth elements wealth is in territories in eastern Ukraine that the Russians have already captured. That's one problem. The other is, of course, that the Ukrainians don't have the resources to exploit these. The agreement called for American companies to do it. It does look like an agreement, long-term leasing and so forth, right out of 19th century imperialist era, the age of new imperialism, 1870 to 1914, as it's called, by the way. On top of that, the ports of Ukraine were to be negotiated for American preponderant control, influence, if you will. I don't want to use the word control. And then the infrastructure, like I said, the infrastructure estimated at least 400 and probably closer to 600 billion. Countries devastated. The U.S. imposing terms on that, the U.S. imposing terms on who can get reconstruction contracts. Countries that did not contribute to the war aid effort of Ukraine could not get it. For example, China, which is in a position, has the companies to go in and do reconstruction on the cheap, by the way. U.S. said, no, can't invite them. They didn't give you anything while the war was going on. The issue of financial control of Ukraine, just as in China after the Boxers Rebellion, by the way, was right there in the open. When Zelensky went into the White House to negotiate this deal, and by the way, the Ukrainians' back is against the wall, and Zelensky went in to actually negotiate such a deal, because he himself, by the way, the Republicans have said in the US, and this is not me, this is the Republicans, but there have been other press reports, has actually made enormous amounts of money, since it's no secret what he did before he went into politics. He was not a millionaire. It turns out he's quite wealthy as a result of entering politics. Fine, that's fine. It's the nature of the business. But the fact is that the people of Ukraine do not receive any of the benefits as a result of any of this. This is to serve the corporate interests of US companies and Western companies. And the question is, the larger question is, what about the national sovereignty of Ukraine? If there is that kind of preponderant control, what does Ukraine get out of this? The US security will guarantee your security. And the US, of course, would dictate their foreign policy, presumably without that ever been negotiated, because the US would be the preeminent power in that economy. So the country would obviously dilute its own sovereignty by entering such a deal. The deal was not signed, by the way. The White House did ask the president of Ukraine to leave. And he did. He went to England. And the Europeans scrambled to see if they can do something separately, which they cannot, by the way, because the United States holds a lot, like President Trump said about Xi Jinping and China, they hold all the right cards in the world balance of power. Well, in this case, in US-European and US-Ukrainian relations, the US holds all the right cards. The US is holding a lot of the cards. And the US is interested in rapprochement with Russia, resolving the Ukrainian conflict by dealing with the Kremlin and looking at its position with Kremlin, to improve its position with Kremlin. Vladimir Putin said, you need rare earth minerals. We have more than they do. We can sit down, do a deal on that, if you like. So there is a response from the Kremlin on that score as well. The larger issue here is what does this do to the position of the United States in the world arena? There are a number of critics who have argued that the United States is not the beneficiary. Clearly, Ukraine is not, Europe is not. Further division between US and Europe as a result of this, by the way, especially coming against the background of tariffs that the US wants to impose on Europe. Russia, is Russia the beneficiary? The initial reaction by analysts was Kremlin is enjoying all of this. I'm not so sure. I think China is really more of a beneficiary from all this because the US needs China to get this deal through. The US needs China to lean on Russia, and it holds a lot of leverage over Russia. It needs China to prevail with this deal, especially since the US is not using Europe as leverage and doesn't want to use Europe as leverage. Because the US has a universal tariff policy, go after, pursue economic nationalism, pursue a tariff policy, Canada, Mexico, European, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, China, hit them all. It's just our interests. Well, when you get to that level, a diplomatic deal between Russia and the United States over Ukraine, the US would need China. And they know it, by the way. The Trump people know it. As inexperienced as Marco Rubio is in foreign affairs, he must have advisors who are indeed articulate on this issue and must have guided him on this matter, that China is the key here. Now, beyond this, there have been some analysts coming from the Cold War liberal, what the GOP calls the deep state neocon liberals, anyway, who have argued that this whole meeting between Zelensky and the White House was a setup. They set him up to embarrass him, to weaken, so that they can serve Kremlin's interest. I think that's too conspiratorial, too Trumpian for me, although it comes from the Cold War liberals. It's that I watched it. I think that because I have conducted research for many decades and I know how meetings are arranged with foreign leaders in the White House, I can tell you that they are briefed, they are presented with bullet points in writing, by the way. They are asked to stick to those points. They are asked to not to be distracted, especially when press is present. The issue of the theatrics, again, there has to be some concern about the degree to which the president, the vice president were really trying to appeal to the base of the GOP, to the nationalist right-wing populists inside the country, and to project an image of intransigence toward the world, and especially world leaders. If you come to the White House to deal with us, you better watch it. We can pull a fast one. I think, however, that as I explained, when you put this into the broader perspective about where the US is trying to go in this phase of its history, as it is facing immense challenges from an economic ascendancy, the economic ascendancy of China, and trying to at least reach some rapprochement with Russia, at least break that a little bit more, and try to get India also more on its side, having Russia and India, two of the major BRICS members, by the way, two of the major BRICS members, besides China, are Russia and India. Well, if the US can bring them at least geopolitically on its side, and also along with economic deals, then perhaps it can that can serve as a counterweight against China. So the containment policy against China works better if the US does this. That makes sense to me. It's rational. And again, the cult of personality and the theatrics and the emotional stuff aside, this does make sense. Now, as far as the Europeans, I want to say a couple of things about that. And where does this leave the Europeans? It is said that the situation for the Europeans looks bad. That they actually, no matter what they say about carving the new chancellor of Germany and so forth, and the Brits, and Macron, the French, Germany, France, and England, these are the major European powers. No matter what they say, well, we got to break more, we got to break more toward an independent course, we're going to strike our own course. The interests of the United States and Britain, or the United States, I'm sorry, and Europe, Britain included, of course, the UK included, are complex and so intertwined at the economic level, at the ideological level, at the political level, at the military level. They're so intertwined that it would take a crisis to break all this off. It would take a real deep crisis to break all this off. For now, the Europeans are, in fact, exactly where the US wants them. Both Biden and Trump want them there as junior partners, by the way. It is sad to say that the European Union, which did so much to try to be an equal to the United States. I just recently read an article in the Jacques Delors. Jacques Delors is a French politician, an advocate of the European Union. And there's an article in the Jacques Delors Institute about how American imperialism is hurting the European Union. And you don't expect to see this in the Jacques Delors think tank, in the Jacques Delors Institute. This is an article like that. You expect something like that from the Chinese and the Russians, but you don't expect it from them. And for them to come out with, with an analytical study like that, it just shows the tension that there is and the delicate nature of relations, transatlantic relations. Transatlantic relations are really on a thin line right now. And I think they can be repaired and salvaged, but a deeper crisis down the road, that will be the end of it. And ultimately, I repeat, China benefits, not necessarily Russia. Russia does benefit in a lesser way, but really the big power on the planet, economic power, is China, and that is the ultimate beneficiary as a result of all this. I want to end it there. I want to invite your questions, your comments, and I want to ask you to join this channel, which is managed by my very good friend, Asad Alim. And until next time, when we have some other topic, the topic of inter-imperialist rivalries, in fact, is something that that we'll have very soon. Thank you very much. Thank you.